Missouri House Speaker Elijah Haahr is leaving the General Assembly's lower chamber due to term limits. But in the 8 years he served, the Springfield Republican dealt with some big challenges and unprecedented crisis. And he has a lot to say about how he made it through it all. Haahr joins us on the latest episode of Politically Speaking, so let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
It's a little complicated in Bolivar because there is a Parsons family there.
But we also knew that it was important to make sure that we got to where we needed to go.
You know, if you walk in a room and you're getting ready to make a decision and everybody in the room looks like you need to stop.
And right now what happens in the United States Senate is as critical as anywhere else in the country.
I really want the state to succeed.
Well, we want everybody to know that we're all working together.
I just worked hard to try to build my name where I didn't have the money.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio political correspondent Jason Rosenbaum. Joining me is my co-host, St. Louis Public Radio State House reporter
Jacqueline Driscoll.
And joining us from his office in Jefferson City, the Speaker of the Missouri House,
Elijah Haahr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We did have you on earlier this year to talk about the session in the era of COVID-19, but we're going to take a broader look at your legislative career, some of the lessons that you learned during your speakership, some of the successes and challenges, and also looking a little forward about elections, since that's a topic that you have been interested in as an attorney. I was telling you before we press record, since you were elected in 2012, everybody was elected in 2012 and served the full 8 years have had to experience the following in the legislature. They had to experience the Ferguson protest movement. A House Speaker resigned, John Deal. Tom Schweik committed suicide. There was the Republican takeover in 2016. There was the near impeachment of a governor in 2018. And then this year, the COVID-19 pandemic completely upended the legislative session and state government. After listing all of that, are you just exhausted thinking about having gone through all of that over the last 8 years?
Some people say the days are long, but the years are short. Our days were exceptionally long. But I remember on our freshman tour in December of 2012, one of my colleagues who served all 8 years with me, Tim Remley, he had a stroke on the freshman tour. And we used to have this running discussion among our class that sort of foretold how hard the next 8 years were going to be. There was just curveballs left and right. So yeah, it's been quite the wild ride. But as I tell everybody, I'm as fortunate. My experience in the Capitol has been as good as it could have possibly have been. And everybody should at one point in their life run for some sort of elective office. If nothing else, you learn your community and your neighbors in a way you never thought you would.
I just wanted to ask you, what has been what would you consider your biggest success story as Speaker of the House?
In the 8 years that I worked here, I think that carrying the tax cut we did in 2018 was my personal one. That was that in the middle of obviously the impeachment process was a challenge to do. So me personally, I think that one was the most interesting, exciting legislative victory I had. But as Speaker of the House, it's funny, you have all these grandiose notions of the bills you're going to pass, and I think we passed a significant amount of them, whether it was the pro-life bill, 126, whether it was the infrastructure and transportation bills, the bonding packages. But frankly, the thing I think we'll always remember when I was Speaker was handling the COVID-19 pandemic. We were February of this year, we just started to hear about it. And I was really fortunate because my chief of staff, his father-in-law, is a doctor at Mass Gen. And so he was one early on that said, this is going to disrupt everything and we need to be prepared for it. And so before we even had a positive case of COVID-19 in Missouri, we put together the committee on disease here in the state. We asked Dr. John Patterson, the representative from the Kansas City area, to head it up. We were having hearings before there was a positive case in the state. So we were sort of ahead of the curve, at least from the House perspective, on moving staff home and having them work remotely, instituting protocols within the Capitol before anybody else was doing it. And I think if you look, we've had all very, very few of our representatives have tested positive. As far as I can tell, none have tested positive from an interaction they had within the Capitol. And I think a lot of that is just the foresight of the staff here, whether it was Dana, the chief clerk, or Kenny, my chief of staff, getting on top of this thing early. The unit or Mississippi, they came in for a special session to change their state flag, ended up having nearly 2/3 of their legislature get COVID while they were in session. We've had, I think, less than 10, maybe even less than 5, and none directly traceable to work in the building. So I think that's a credit to the work that the staff here has done in building a safe environment for us to continue to do the people's work. If there's anything I think we'll be remembered for, it's sort of carrying on the process during a sort of a pandemic that none of us really knew how to handle.
I want to give a shout out to Dana just because I work with her and we need it in this podcast. I love Dana. She is awesome. Another question I had, since you are termed here, we just recently had Representative Kip Kendrick on a Politically Speaking episode, and he talked a lot about how his decision to leave office was based on term limits, and he didn't necessarily think that 8 years was long enough. I wanted to get your perspective on another side of the aisle, but you're the Speaker of the House. Do you feel like you had a good run in the State House? Do you wish you could have more? What's your take on that?
So what I would always say is that term limits would be far more successful if everyone was term limited. So if the lobbyists and the bureaucracy had the same term limits the legislative branch did, we would have a much more balanced ability to move legislation. Unfortunately, when the lobbyists can be here for 30 years and they can, if you're going to kill something of theirs, they're going to put it in the drawer for 8 years and then they'll try to back out. It creates a position of imbalance of power that we deal with. And I think there is a scenario where term limits show some value, but I think within a building like this, when you operate constantly at you have less knowledge base than the people that you are maybe trying to go up against and reform. I think it puts us at a position of disadvantage, and I don't think it's the most helpful thing for the state to continue to pass good legislation when our legislators are going to be constantly at a knowledge imbalance when they go up against the lobbyists and the bureaucracy.
Well, and Jacqueline and I often mention that we're both from Illinois. I'm very proud of that fact. Jacqueline is too. One of the things I don't think we're super proud of, though, is that the Speaker of the Illinois House, Michael Madigan, has been Speaker since before both of us were born, except for a 2-year stretch. And I definitely understand the argument against term limits, that it drains institutional knowledge and it ushers people out of the legislature too soon. But just the fact that the leader of the Illinois House has been there for 30 plus years seems a little odd and unseemly, and is probably the best argument for term limits. Like, what do you make of what do you make of that particular example?
Obviously, I think there's going to be bad apples on either side of this, and I think there's going to be good apples on either side of this. And I think you can look through history, and there's leaders of whether it's states or other countries that have been in office for decades that have been extraordinarily good leaders, or there at a time when we needed them to be there longer than an arbitrary number. At the same time, you're going to have bad apples that outlive their effective or usefulness, and especially have figured out a way to abuse the system such that they stay in their office longer than really they should. I'm a big fan of believing that the people are the ultimate term limit on anyone. I know in the Federalist Papers, they considered and expressly rejected the idea of putting term limits in the Constitution. The idea of the president serving only 2 terms really started because George Washington voluntarily chose not to run again. But frankly, I think there's a big debate that's an intellectual debate of, do we believe that our presidents have been that much better than our Congresses because of term limits? And I don't know that there's an answer to that, but in my mind, I think you've got just as many bad presidents if you've had bad congressionals or bad senators. I'm not sure that term limits has made that position any better than it would have been otherwise.
Do you feel if you weren't term limited that you would have like more life left in you? I mean, that's a weird way of putting it, but I mean, do you wish you had more time to be in the House to pass meaningful legislation?
Here's the thing, and just being totally honest, if it weren't for term limits, I would not have gotten elected as young as I did, because the people that were elected at the time, they could have continued to run for election. I wouldn't have had the chance to be here as young as I am. And so I will never say that I wish they didn't have term limits, because I'd like to serve here longer. I do love the policy give and take, but as everybody who knows me or follows me on social media knows, I've got 4 kids that are 9 and under, and the opportunity to pick them up from school every day and drop them off the next morning is a pretty good incentive to be ready to go home. And if there weren't term limits, obviously I'd want to take the opportunity to be up here and continue to effectuate public policy. The arbitrary of this, though, is that there's a really good upside that starting on January 5th, when the new speaker is sworn in, I'll spend every night at home with my kids, and that there's a lot to be said for that.
I actually want to touch on that, because one of the things that I've mentioned a number of times is I just can't really imagine scenarios where people with children who make, I don't know, between $30,000 and $60,000 a year would ever consider running for office, just because they can't take the income. Like, you make $35,000 a year plus per diem as a legislator. So somebody who's making $40,000 or $50,000 a year is not going to take that pay cut. The other thing too is, like, it has to be a real amount of difficulty to be in Jefferson City for 5 months out of the year and be away from your small children all the time. Like, how do you manage that? And what do you make of the fact that, like, the legislature is inherently discriminating against people who are working class or middle class and don't have flexible schedules like you do as an attorney, basically?
One, you're absolutely right. From the perspective of job, you almost have to be either retired, self-employed, or a stay-at-home in order to make this schedule work. It's very difficult to find employers that are willing to allow you to leave for 5 months. On a personal note, you're absolutely right. People with young children, it's extraordinarily challenging for them to do. I've got 4 kids, and I'm a single dad, and I have them the bulk of the time. And the ability to balance out the time that I'm in Jefferson City, obviously they're in school during the days, but at night I work a lot with, my parents have been very involved in picking them up from school. We're really fortunate because of modern technology. I can FaceTime them and I basically see them every day. Those are opportunities they'll never have. But yeah, it's an incredibly challenging position for people to consider running for if they have a traditional job that's 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and if they have children that are young enough that to try to figure out how to make that work is an extraordinarily big challenge. One of the things that we looked at early on in my speakership that we were not able to make happen was to see if there was a way that we could provide childcare for legislators, such that if you wanted to bring your children with you, that there was a place to watch them. We looked at, there's at least one other state that has a pilot program going for that, and we tried to consider if that was a thing we could do. We got to a position where we didn't think we could make it happen here. And then, I'm a natural optimist. So my best positive spin on COVID, we lost 7-8 weeks of our legislative session this spring, but it happened to be the 7 or 8 weeks my kids were going to be out of school. So I got to spend 7 or 8 weeks, just me and my kids at my house. That was sort of a fun time and opportunity I wouldn't have had otherwise. And so, it presents real challenges. And I can tell you, back in 2017 and 18, when I was running around the state trying to recruit people to run for office, the first 2 things they brought up were, how will I do it with my job and how will I do it with my kids? And it presents a barrier to a lot of these, the people of the state to consider running for office that maybe you don't have the best cross-section of Missourians sitting on the floor because you don't have the most diverse group, because they can't figure out a way to overcome those barriers.
Would journalists be able to use the Capitol childcare?
The idea that we were trying to work around was, if we could find childcare that had up to 20 spots per week for 4 days, and it would sort of operate on a first come, first served basis, but sort of a rotating lottery where if you wanted to bring your kids up the 2nd and 6th week and maybe the 9th week or something like that, those weeks you'd have a high lottery, and then basically we get everybody the chance to bring their kids to the Capitol. They could see them every night and every morning and then come here and do their work. Like I said, we got to a place where we couldn't figure out how to make it work financially. Obviously, we came up with a couple different ideas and we couldn't figure it out. But it's something that I think would be, you look at Fortune 500 companies, and that is the sort of the new wave of recruitment is, hey, we're going to provide you childcare, well, maybe on site. That's the way they market and attract people to the job. And I think the legislature would be wise to do something similar.
Yeah, before we go to break, let's actually parlay this whole thing into policy. Like, if there's anything that COVID-19 has exposed, it's just how porous and unsupported a lot of childcare providers are. You're not going to be in the legislature, but it does seem like this crisis provides like an impetus to maybe your colleagues in the future to provide some sort of funding stream or assistance.
Yeah, and like you said, COVID sort of presents a different issue set for people to consider as far as issues that are on the agenda more because of dealing with something like this. But yeah, I think obviously one of the biggest challenges people have, even when it comes to just having a job, is knowing like who's going to watch their children and how they're going to do that in a safe manner. And when schools close, or during a pandemic like we have, when your daycare suddenly says, hey, we've had a positive case, so the kids are coming home for a week, that makes it impossible for a lot of people to continue to work at a traditional job. And I mean, figuring out a way to handle childcare trickles down into figuring out a way to make our economy run more smoothly. So yeah, that's something I think we should always keep sort of on the how do we make sure that people in our society have a way to get to work, and a big part of that is them having safe and reasonable childcare.
We'll be right back after this quick break with House Speaker Elijah Haahr. And we're back on Politically Speaking with House Speaker Elijah Haahr. I mentioned on the outset that you dealt with a lot of what I would consider crisis-like events, both inside and outside the legislature. I'd be interested to hear like what you feel like of those things I mentioned, or maybe things I didn't mention. What was like the biggest challenge that you faced? And let's take COVID-19 out of the equation, since we've talked about that a lot. Besides COVID-19, what was the biggest crisis challenge you faced as a legislator?
You know, when I served as pro tem, we obviously went through the Eric Greitens saga, and that was an extraordinarily challenging time for the House, for the caucus, the Republican caucus. It is a very uncomfortable position where you have to sit in judgment of somebody in your own party. There was obviously a lot of very diverse opinions within the caucus as to what to do about that. And I was in a supportive role as pro tem. Todd Richardson, the former speaker, was the guy who had to carry the brunt of that. And I will say, and I think this is unanimous among the House, Todd probably handled it as well as anybody could have handled it, with grace and class, and trying to get to a just outcome. But I think that was probably as challenging a time as I can remember in the General Assembly, because you overlaid all the issues that were going on with that. And we had weekly and sometimes daily news stories breaking on it, new information coming to light, or just dealing with the hearings within the Capitol. And you had to overlay that with trying to pass policy issues. And in the end, we had an extraordinarily successful policy session during that year. We passed, you know, the largest tax cut in state history, a really big energy redevelopment plan. We did a ton of stuff policy-wise, all while having the special investigation committee that was meeting. We were hustling or bringing witnesses into the building. We were trying to, no offense to the media, but trying to get witnesses in without the media knowing who they were, because a lot of them did not want to be publicly identified in the case. And so it was a very big challenge to keep confidentiality going during that period of time. And, you know, I had to sit in this office more hours than I can count, watching Todd have to transition back and forth between handling of that case, policy agendas, dealing with the Senate, I watched him when his phone would ring and it would be the governor himself calling to try to talk about this stuff, or be national figures reaching out to Todd and trying to sway it one way or the other. That is probably as challenging a session as I can remember, that, you know, seeing someone deal with, just sitting here all the time. And I've said it before, I go to other states, I tell people about the situation that year, and it's sort of unbelievable when you tell people. It sounds more like a movie, and it should be a movie, because the stuff that we went through and just the stories that came out of that are almost impossible to believe are real life.
I was texting with somebody the other day about the fact that Jason Smith, who's a congressman former House member, and Todd Richardson ran against each other for that 8th district seat. And I said something along the lines of, I thought Jason Smith got the better end of that deal, because not only is he now like extremely powerful, even though he's only 40 years old, but even though Todd Richardson got to be speaker, had to be speaker earlier than he expected because John Deal resigned, and then had to deal with one of the biggest crises in the state's history in his last year. I can't really imagine having to deal with that, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for former Speaker Richardson to be able to come out of that still wanting to be in public service, since he is the Medicaid director now.
Todd is an extraordinarily talented person, and watching him handle that, like I said, it presents a very different set of challenging circumstances to a situation like COVID, which is challenging in and of itself. But there was a lot of caucus members that wanted Todd to do one thing or the other, and thought he owed it to the state or to the party to handle it in certain ways. And Todd always focused on, there's going to be a truth that we have to find, and it's our job to do that. And Todd always told me something that has always stuck with me, which half the people will always dislike whatever bill you pass or legislation you pass or decision you get to. But he's like, the goal is to have as many people trust the process as possible. And Todd was really good about people trusting the process. He was very open about, this is how we're going to handle something. This is what we're going to do. And everybody's going to know what we're going to do. And so even if you disagree to the result we get to, everybody's going to have their appropriate input. And it's something that I've tried to keep going. And I think the House has tried. We've gone from essentially one camera in the on the House floor to now 6 high definition cameras on the House floor. We're recording and live stream all of our committee hearings. We have gotten to a place where everybody in the state can watch every single thing that we do all the time. And I think that sort of sunshine stemmed from the good government practice that Todd wanted to implement, and we've been able to sort of expand upon.
Yes, especially in COVID times. I totally appreciated having the live streams available, because I did not want to go into the Capitol or bring my kids there. I want to switch topics just a bit and talk about the special legislative session, the first one that kind of ended after the governor had called to expand the legislation to allow the Attorney General to prosecute murder cases in St. Louis. This came as a shock to me personally, and talking to some Democrats, they were also shocked by it. I assumed that was a difficult call because the Senate did push through that legislation there towards the end. So I just wanted your take on that. What prompted that decision? How did that come about? And again, expand on how that was, if it was a challenge.
So at the beginning of the special session on crime, we agree with some of the governor's proposals. The primary one being how we handled police officers in St. Louis and their residency. That to me was always sort of the cornerstone of that session. And I think the House and the Senate, the governor, we worked to get that portion done. There was one portion that gave me some pretty significant heartburn, which was changing how we prosecute juveniles. And so we made a decision pretty early on in the House. We didn't want to move that piece of the legislation, but we had gotten to a point where we thought we sort of had a path going forward. The governor expanded the call while the bill was in the Senate. We'd already passed sort of a House version, and so when it was coming back and the Senate was going to take up the expanded call, we had several conference calls with our caucus and had a real split in the caucus as to the expanded call, to the point that we had a lot of caucus members that did not want to proceed, or that had heartburn with one or two parts of the rest of it. And so by the time we got back, we had passed the what I thought was the signature piece that changing the residency laws for St. Louis police officers. We'd funded the Witness Protection Fund. I thought those were the two biggest pieces, and I commend Governor Parson and the Senate for moving those. We did not have an agreement among the caucus on the rest of the pieces, and so we made the decision to go ahead and adjourn and not take up the rest of it. I think outside the building, there was a lot of surprise when we did that. We told the Senate and we told the executive branch prior to going out on the House floor and doing that. We gave them a heads up we're going to do it. And obviously they were frustrated because they'd done a lot of work to get it to a place where it was at, but we did not have the caucus support to continue. And so
instead of putting caucus members through a fairly arduous debate and difficult vote that I don't know whether or not would have been positive, we as a leadership team made the decision. We had passed the two big signature pieces that we thought were important, the governor thought was important, and that was the extent of the work we felt we needed to do. And so we went out, we adjourned sine die on that special session. And like I said, I think we got the two signature pieces done.
How upset were the governor and the attorney general that you didn't get the concurrent jurisdiction done?
You know, here's the thing. The governor's always been really good to work with. And obviously they were, you know, his staff was somewhat frustrated when we first informed them what we were going to do. But we've maintained a really good working relationship with them. Obviously we had to, again, with the budget special session coming up. We worked with them again on trying to get in a position on the COVID liability special session and working out those issues. You know, his staff in particular, Jeff Earl and Robert Nodell, have been really good friends of mine and do an incredibly good job for him. And yeah, of course, they did put a lot of work into it to try to get it done, and especially out of the Senate. So there was some short-term frustration, but hey, Caleb Rowden, the Senate Majority Leader, is a good friend of mine. He does a great job over there. We try to give him the heads up. And I told them candidly before they decided to PQ the filibuster. I didn't know if we were going to be able to take it up in the House. And so we had those conversations, we made the decisions, and we continued to work together on the budget special, on the COVID liability special. And I think those relationships will continue. Like I said, I have nothing but the best respect for Jeff Earl and Robert Nodell. They did so much work on those special sessions and do a really great job for the governor.
I really like this conversation, and I think it's important for people who listen to this podcast who may not be so insider baseball like Jason or I. When you're talking about these conversations that you're having amongst your caucus, amongst other leadership in the Senate or with the governor's staff, I wonder if you could expand on that. Does that happen with every piece of legislation, only the big stuff? I really think that that's important for people to know the process and kind of look behind the curtain.
So it just depends. You know, I have a lot of conversations. I have some with the governor directly, but I have a lot of conversations with like I said, Robert Nodell, his deputy chief of staff, Jeff Earl, his legislative liaison. I have very regular conversations with them. Every piece of legislation, I have a pretty strong inner circle with my staff. My chief of staff, Kenny Ross, Julie Baker, our legal counsel, Ryan Nonemaker, and Erica Angleby. We sit around, and every single bill that we refer in the House, we discuss on a roundtable when we do bill referrals. I don't know how other speakers do it, but we had a pretty thorough vetting process. I mean, we would literally sit around a table. If I turn my camera around, there's a table here, and we would pick our bills, and then we'd go person by person on one bill they really liked that week, one bill they really didn't like that week, what were the reasons, what we should do with it. And then as we got to some of those bigger signature pieces of legislation, I can tell you some of the stuff that we passed, not every member of my staff thought was a great bill, and some of the stuff that I chose not to take up, they thought were really good. When we were doing something that the Senate had gone to extraordinary lengths to pass or to get over to us, or something the governor was a priority of his, we tried as much as possible to bring his people in on those conversations. And that was a hard conversation to have because I like those people. I knew they'd done a lot of work on it. But I also felt that it was a good idea. And frankly, the way everybody should do business, to tell them up front. Now, it's not like I called them a week out and said, if this comes out, we're never going to take it up. We decided, maybe the day before, the morning of, that we didn't think we had the caucus votes to take it up. And so we said, let's reach out immediately and let them know. And they handled it like gentlemen. And, we continue to have a good working relationship. But, that's the thing. You're right, Jacqueline. From an outsider perspective, we think about bills and we think about sort of the macros. But this is a personal relationship building, and those relationships matter more than anything else in here. And so you are going to disagree, and there are going to be times you fight, but those people, they fundamentally want the same things we do. As everybody wants. They want good jobs, they want better streets and strong schools. We disagree sometimes how to get from here to there, but the personal relationships matter a lot. And if every one of these political or policy disagreements become personal, you sort of lose the ability to function as a government.
So according to your Wikipedia page, you are only 38 years old, to go with our discussion about term limits. You did not run for anything this year, which probably was a big relief that you didn't have to. You didn't have to lead a legislative chamber during a pandemic and run for statewide office, although there was nothing for you to run for statewide office since they were all people already in office. What's next for you politically? The chatter that I've heard as far as like one of your next steps is if the 7th district seat, which is held by Billy Long, becomes vacant, you would probably be a prime contender for that. But I'm sure that you may not want to run for anything and just may want to be a lawyer and a dad for the foreseeable future. Please break some news on this show and talk about how you're going to run for something. Please, I'm desperate for news right now.
When I figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up, I'll let everybody else know. But Robin Voss, who's the Speaker of the House in Wisconsin, they don't have term limits there, but he taught a new speaker orientation when I first got elected, and I went to it. And he said to everybody, he's like, there's 2 ways to handle being Speaker of the House. And he's like, they're not wrong or right, they're just different. One is to treat Speaker of the House as sort of, I'm going to be Speaker and then I'm going to run for something else. And the other is to treat Speaker of the House as the last political job you're ever going to have. And he's like, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but he said you will treat the position differently depending on how you view it. I made a pretty strong decision after hearing that I did not want to be a candidate in 2020 because I didn't want to make any decisions as Speaker of the House based on me trying to run for another office at the time. And so it helped, like you said, every statewide office in 2020 was held by a Republican. They were running for re-election. It was great to support that ticket as they did that. And I've got a lot of really good friends that are in statewide office. Scott Fitzpatrick, the current treasurer, we got elected to the state house together and we've been really good friends. And he, to see him get elected to state treasurer was a great thing. But I will say this, I love policy and I love politics. And I am really looking forward to spending the next year or two home with my kids before I have to make a decision about if there's another race to be run. I don't know if there is or when that would happen. But I also, Joe Strauss, who used to be the Speaker of the House down in Texas, I went and had brunch with him a few months ago, and he asked me, he's like, what's next? And I said, I was like, I'm going to go back. I'm going to practice law. I've got kids at home. I'm excited for that. But I am interested if there's another run down the road. And he's like, well, Elijah's like, you're 38. He said, I didn't run for state rep until I was 48 and I became Speaker at 52. He's like, you don't have to be in a hurry for anything to happen. You don't get the chance to see your kids every day. If you are in elective office. So he's like, take this opportunity to enjoy being home. And he's like, the next opportunity will present itself when the timing's right. And so, if there's never another run in my future, I've had the most extraordinary 8 years I could imagine. And if there is another run in the future, the timing will be right when that run presents itself. Right now, the timing's right for me to go home, be a dad and be an attorney and sort of watch all of this from the outside. And I'm excited to do that.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. As Jacqueline said, this went in some really great directions, which I was really glad that we could talk about some of the rigors and sacrifices of legislative service. For all of our stories, stlpublicradio.org. Follow me on Twitter at jrosenbaum. You can hear my son, Declan, in the background as well. Jacqueline, how can we follow you on Twitter?
Driscoll NPR.
Please name off the 10 Twitter accounts that you have, which has become a running gag whenever you're on the show.
I have consolidated all of my Twitter accounts to simply one, at Elijah Haahr. I used to try to have a legislative one and a personal one, and then I even tried tweeting in Spanish for a while. And at some point, I decided that it was too much for even me to keep up with, and I consolidated it all to one. So it's only at Elijah Haahr.
It's a shame the Spanish one is gone. Those were some great times. Thank you very much. So long.